Hey there, Wojcik here, and in this video I'm going to show you how to manually set up your camera with the proper settings, 7 different settings we're going to go through to make sure that you're shooting high quality, great video that looks good. So we're going to dive into some technical stuff, some settings maybe you haven't changed, maybe you've been shooting in auto mode. That's okay, that's a great way to start. What's more important is you're putting videos out, but we're going to focus on how to make them look better, how to make sure that you have complete control over what's going on. But I'll give you, this is kind of the cliff notes, the shortened version of if you just set your camera to these things, you're going to be fine most of the time. Now, if you want to go more in depth on the more technical parts of your camera, just the basics though, like what settings and proper adjustments you should use to film yourself, I do have a full course on that. I'll talk about it at the end of this video, but let's get right into the first of the 7 settings that you should change. First up, we're going to make sure you're in the right mode. Now, you may have been shooting in automatic mode or A on your camera, or maybe AV or TV or some other kind of program mode. But if you want full control of your camera, you want to switch it to manual. So whether there's a physical dial or it's something in the menu, you want to make sure your camera says M for manual. The reason you want to film in manual is because you want full control, first of all, but second of all, if you're shooting in some automatic mode, you can't change most of the other things that I'm about to explain to you. So make sure you're in manual mode and we'll jump into the next one. Number 2, make sure you're filming in the highest resolution possible that your camera enables you to do, with one caveat. If your computer can't handle 4K and it's chugging and it's going to slow you down during the editing process, just film in 1080p or whatever resolution your computer can handle, because what's more important is you can actually get through the videos. But let's say you have a newer computer, let's say you can film in 4K or whatever resolution you want that's the highest on your camera, make sure that's set up properly. So here on this Canon EOS R, you can see here I have 4K set up, and that is what is the highest resolution that this camera can do. And the reason you want to be in a higher resolution is because let's say you accidentally left something on the outside of your frame, you can crop it in a little bit, it's going to be high quality still. Or if you want to actually zoom in on a shot and then zoom back out, you want to make sure it is of pristine quality. So highest resolution your camera can use, as long as your computer can handle it. Next up is frame rate. Now, for 98% of the people out there, you're going to want to be shooting in 30 frames per second. It's what television is shot with, and most content should, I think, be filmed at 30 frames per second. Now, the exceptions are going to be twofold. Number one, if you're shooting something more cinematic, you're trying to film a movie, let's say, go to 24 frames per second. That's what movies are shot on. Or if you're going to be doing slow motion, go ahead and film in 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second and then slow that down. So let me show you in the camera how you would do that. So in this one here, I have my resolution and frame rate all within the same menu. You can see there's 30 frames per second, 24 frames, 60 frames. I'm going to stick to 30 frames per second. And one more quick tip here. If you have 2 options there, if you have all I and IPB, you'll notice if I jump to IPB, that gives me more space on my memory card, but it's still really high quality. So you probably don't need to be filming in all I. You could film in IPB and you get almost 4 times the amount of space on your memory card. Next up is shutter speed. So this you want to have at double your frame rate. So I just said in the previous one, you probably want to shoot at 30 frames per second. So double that is going to be 60. So you're going to want to film at 1/60th. It's a fraction. It's basically how fast the frame is opening and closing, 1/60th of a second. So in the menu here, you can see I already have it set to 1/60th, but let's say I'm filming at 24 frames per second, that would be 48, and the nearest thing on this camera is 1/50th. Now, if you're doing slow motion, you could double that as well, or you could just continue to keep using 1/60. The next one is aperture, and this is going to be different depending on what lens you're using, but in general, you want to be filming with a shallow depth of field, which means you have some things blurred behind what is in focus, you most likely. And the lower that number is, so f4, f3.2, f2.8, the lower that number is, it means the less is in focus. So if you're going for a shallow depth of field with a blurred background behind the subject, you're going to want to keep that number low. And so typically, unless you have a very expensive lens, the lowest that number is going to go is either f4 or f2.8 typically. So that would be the aperture that I would use to film almost everything I'm filming on, unless maybe I'm outside and I want to show a landscape and I want a lot of things in focus. Typically, I just want the video to show what's in focus and have the rest of the stuff kind of fall off into blurriness. So if we look at my camera here, you can see I can go all the way down to f1.2. This is a very expensive 85mm lens that has a nice big aperture, which is that lower number. But if I'm filming myself talking, that's going to be way too shallow of a depth of field. If I lean forward or lean back, I'm going to go out of focus. So I would just keep it somewhere around f2.8 to maybe 3.2, 3.5, or f4. Next up is ISO or ISO, and this is the sensitivity of your camera to light. The lower the number, the better visual quality you will have on your camera. So when possible, you want to keep your ISO as low as possible. But if you notice when you lower your ISO all the way down to 100, let's say, it gets very dark. So you want to have your ISO at a level that's high enough to actually make sure everything is bright enough and you can see everything and things aren't overexposed or too bright or things are too dark. So you got to pick that ISO level depending on the environment you're filming in. But the higher you go, kind of the noisier your image will get. You'll get grain and little things moving around and the quality just won't look as nice. So keep your ISO as low as you can when possible, but use that to determine how bright your image is going to be. The seventh setting you want to change in manual mode is your white balance. Let's actually jump into menu because I can kind of describe it a little bit easier when you see all the different options. So I'm going to hit Q here, jump into the white balance, and you can see there are a bunch of different options. AWB stands for auto white balance. This means that whatever you're filming, it's going to kind of analyze the different lights that are in your room, the different colors of them, and try to determine what kind of white balance or what things are white in that image and do its best. The problem with filming an auto white balance is if you're filming a long video, it can constantly change. So if you're vlogging or you're running and gunning and you're out and about, maybe auto white balance is great because you'll be outside 1 minute, you'll be inside with some different colored lights and you don't really have time to play around with it. But if you're filming in a static environment, it's important to take it off of auto white balance. So as you turn or you wear a different colored shirt or what have you, it's not changing all over the place. So for white balance, you have other options instead of auto. You have daylight, shade, cloudy, tungsten light, fluorescent light. So if you're in any of those environments, you're out in the sun, you're in the shade, it's an overcast day, any of those kinds of examples, pick that option and it'll look pretty good. But if you're in a controlled environment, the best setting is to actually go custom a little bit and choose Kelvin. So I'm going to jump back in here and go to Kelvin. And this is the actual color temperature. So 5600 is a color temperature. I know, I said this is going to get a little technical, but if you're filming with daylight lights, like I'm filming with right now, this is about 5600. It's about 6000 Kelvin. So if you set your camera to a specific Kelvin number that matches your lights that you're using, then your white balance will stay the same the whole time and it'll look nice. Now this light back here, it's warmer, so that's closer to maybe 3200. So if I was only using tungsten style, warmer, yellower lights, I could change the white balance so it looked more normal. Like I said, this is getting very technical, but if you want to go more in depth into all of these settings and more on how to basically understand your camera so you know what it's doing or how you can change it to make it look a certain way, I have a full course on how to do that. More information below. Beyond just telling you what different settings you should use, if you want to learn more about each of those things I talked about, white balance, aperture, frame rate, shutter speed, ISO, all of those things and more, things like basic audio settings, focus modes in your camera, how to make sure you're always in focus, framing, where should you be in the shot, all of those things I go more into detail in my Camera Basics course, which you can find out more info below. Hope to see you there. If you want to kind of start to master your camera, learn how to have full control over the different settings and not be overwhelmed when you pick it up and not know what to do. So hope to see you inside that course if you're interested. And if not, at least you learned a little bit about more of how your camera works and some settings that you can use to film your next video. Cheers.